Close your eyes. Actually, it's okay if you don't, but listen to this. Now, listen to this. If you know your stuff, then you'd recognize that the first batch of music is a selection of music from Western video games like Battlefield and God of War. The second was a selection of Japanese video game music from games like Pokemon and Final Fantasy. So, which is better? The second batch of songs are all more instantly recognizable despite the pop culture status of the first batch. Does that make the second better or the first? First of all, implying one is better than the other is taking a hard objective stance, which is totally reasonable in the world of music as there is such a thing as good and bad music. But can you really compare two different cultures trying to accomplish two different things with their music? And as a disclaimer, I want to make it clear that I'm only talking about original music composed specifically for a certain game, not licensed soundtracks you might find in Need for Speed. Some games, like Grand Theft Auto, feature both an original score and a licensed soundtrack, but if I talk about games like that, keep in mind that I'm only referring to original compositions. Cool? Cool. Before you can really begin to compare the two regional styles of music, I think you have to start with genre. Game genre, that is. Despite Westerners enjoying Japanese games and vice versa, culturally, there's some significant differences between the two regions when it comes to game design and content preferences. Western video games are, most regularly, third-person action games, open-world games, first-person shooters, and, as the name implies, Western RPGs. Japanese games are, most regularly, adventure games, fighting games, action games, and, as the name implies once again, Japanese RPGs. Out of all of those, I mostly want to talk about the two different kinds of RPGs, what makes them unique to their respective regions, and what both hope to achieve. The goal of a Western RPG is to immerse the player in a world and for them to embody an avatar and make choices based on the character they want to be. The emphasis is on player choice in both a narrative and gameplay context, often featuring traditional RPG roles like warrior, rogue, and mage, all adapted for the kind of world the developer creates. There are some exceptions like The Witcher, where the player is offered choice despite assuming the role of a specific character. The games that really exemplify what I mean are games like Mass Effect, The Elder Scrolls, Knights of the Old Republic, Divinity Original Sin, Fallout, Pillars of Eternity, you get it. It really all comes down to offering the player the chance to choose the kind of power fantasy they'd like to experience, by giving them the tools to fully immerse themselves into the role they choose for the world they're in. Again, it's about freedom, choice, and immersion. JRPGs, on the other hand, are a little more linear. There is freedom in the wide open, explorable environments with side quests and optional content, but you're mostly working your way through a defined story with a defined set of characters. There usually aren't too many choices that affect the outcome of the game's story or world. The choices the player makes are usually about which party members to use, which weapons or armor to equip, or whether or not they wish to inquire deeper into certain NPC dialogue. I'm talking Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Persona. Aside from something like Pokemon, these aren't games that tend to spit the player back into the open world after they roll credits like many Western RPGs do. It's not about experiencing everything there is to do or checking off boxes of things to do. It's a tailored narrative and gameplay experience meant to make the player leave with their journey forever etched into their heart and soul. Now, what's something you do a lot of in RPGs, both Western and Japanese, more than almost anything else? Walking. In Skyrim, you might walk from Riverwood to Whiterun, from Whiterun to Rorikstead, from Rorikstead to Falkreath. In Pokemon, you might walk from Pallet Town to Viridian City, from Viridian City to Lavender Town, from Lavender Town back to Viridian City. Where am I going with this? When you're walking somewhere in Skyrim, Bethesda wants you to look at the trees and to take in the scenery while you think about what will happen when you show up to Ivarstead to climb the nearby mountain. It's meant to be immersive, and the music reflects that. It's not this upbeat bop, nor is it a typically complex symphony of strings and bass. It's usually a more introspective piece, meant to make the player ponder their place in this world and to plant them more firmly in their role as a Dragonborn in the land of Tamriel. When you're walking somewhere in Pokemon, Game Freak doesn't want you to stop and smell the roses. They want you to be filled with a sense of determination and appreciation for the denizens of the world they've created. The music is almost meant to be a motivating factor rather than something that assists the player with immersion. Just listen to how each game wants you to perceive their worlds. See what I mean? It's not that Game Freak doesn't want the player to feel immersed, it's just that they'd rather have something propelling the player forward than something planting them in the moment, as is the case with Skyrim. This observation has led to the creation of what I call the immersion versus attachment theory, which I think is an interesting design theory to look into, not just for those like me who seek to observe and analyze games, but also for those seeking to create games with a clear design approach in mind. Here's my explanation of this theory I just made up and could totally be super dumb for all I know. What a lot of Japanese developers seek with their games is attachment, not immersion. They want the player to attach themselves to a world and its characters, and one of the best ways to do that is to have associative music that plays at certain areas and during certain moments, like in a city, or in a cave, or just walking around. This is what I meant earlier about two different cultures trying to achieve two different things with their music. However, just because attachment may be the focus instead of immersion, that doesn't mean there can't be both at once. And to demonstrate, I created this nice Venn diagram to showcase exactly what I mean. Basically, the stuff under the immersion tab are all genres with games that are focused on total player immersion. They want the player to feel like they are in the game and either have control over its world or to feel like the main character is an extension or avatar of themselves. Third-person shooters are the only thing I could see being in the both category, but I put it in immersive due to those games usually relying on realistic visuals, intuitive controls, and an atmospheric soundtrack to make the player feel like they're a part of the world. As for attachment, these are all games that are inherently unimmersive due to camera perspective or concept. I could see the argument for arcade racers being in the both category due to their emphasis on sound design and visuals, but I figure that due to the unrealistic physics, licensed soundtrack, and their focus on the accessible user experience over a realistic driving experience, it belongs in the attachment category. Finally, there are the genres that fit into both. I chose sports because even though games like NBA 2K and Madden NFL are essentially simulations, the player takes more of a god role akin to an RTS or a puzzle game, plus licensed soundtracks. Adventure games like The Legend of Zelda due to their reliance on exploration and environments, but also their emphasis on foreground soundtracks and fourth wall breaking to explain certain gameplay mechanics. Survival horror for the immersion required in order to properly scare the player, but there's also a focus on memorizing certain environments and gamifying certain elements like item management, ammo conservation, and weapon upgrades. And I think the final two are a bit self-explanatory based on what I've already said. Now, to loop this all the way back to where we started about Western versus Japanese music scores, think back to the genres I associated with each culture. Western video games are first-person action games, first-person shooters. Japanese games are adventure games, fighting games, action games, Japanese RPGs. Hey, Wait a second. Western video games are third-person action games, Japanese games, adventure games, fighting games, action Japanese RPGs. There it is. To kind of simplify what I've discussed so far and relate it to my immersion versus attachment theory, Western video games tend to have music in the background, while Japanese tend to have music in the foreground. Simple, right? An example would be to look at a game like Mega Man X. Great game, right? Great soundtrack, right? When you play Mega Man X, that music is right in the foreground, cranked up. It doesn't dip under the action when it gets tense, it never crossfades into another song. Every stage has a theme, and it blasts that sucker on loop until the stage is done. Now, maybe you find yourself playing Uncharted, and most of the noise is from the environment. The music that is there is mostly ambient or supplementary to the tone of the situation at hand. It's in the background. It's like a film.
How did you know to do that?
Oh, there's one thing I've learned from you. Press everything.
Western video game music in general is a bit more filmy. A lot of the music is built to supplement a certain scene or tone, rather than to give a distinct identifying factor to a specific area or character. Mind you, there are still some very distinct Western compositions, like the one at the beginning of the video, but I'm talking specifically about music that plays during gameplay. However, generalizing music by genre or culture just isn't that simple anymore. While researching genres for this video, I realized something. A lot of the genres that might have gotten their start in Japan are mostly being taken care of by Western developers today, such as Metroidvanias like Ori and the Blind Forest, Axiom Verge, and Hollow Knight, platformers like A Hat in Time, Yooka-Laylee, and Celeste, and even strategy RPGs like the Banner Saga, XCOM, and Wargroove. And there are plenty of Japanese games that seek to immerse the player just as much as Western games can, but they tend to have some sort of unique Japanese flair that sets them apart from any contemporary they might have. Not only that, but there are plenty of Western games throughout the years that defy my theory and blur the lines too. And instead of going through each one individually and inflating this video to a comically long runtime, although I might be too late for that, I'm just gonna list some games, both Western and Japanese, that might be in a genre that's on one side of the graph, but they still land between the two in their own way. Here's just a few examples. Super Metroid, Halo 1 and 2, Metal Gear Solid, Inside, Yakuza, Resident Evil 2, God of War, The Witness, Grand Theft Auto, Batman Arkham Knight, Hollow Knight, Doom, and much more, of course. Really think about how each of these games use music in regards to their genre, or more specifically, their perspective and gameplay. Think about side-scrollers with ambient music, or first-person games with easily identifiable soundtracks, and consider if the goal of the developer was immersion, attachment, or both. I know it's probably a bit weird to hear me talking about game genres so much in a video that was incepted as an observation and comparison of the music of two different regions and cultures, but I hope my dissection of the genre music association makes enough sense to justify that. Hopefully this game design theory gives you something to think about in regards to your favorite games, or any game you find yourself playing. So, to answer the question, is Japanese video game music better or more important than Western video game music? This is a cop-out answer, but here's how I judge almost anything. How well does it succeed at what it's trying to accomplish? If you want to take a purely logistical standpoint and look at things mathematically, Japanese video games, on average, probably have more memorable scores. You're dealing with Final Fantasy, Sonic, Persona, Mega Man, Metal Gear, and pretty much everything from Nintendo. It's kind of hard to compete. However, if you're looking at it from a general impact perspective, it's hard to argue that something like the Halo or Skyrim theme isn't just as, if not more, culturally impactful as something like the Zelda or Mario theme. When it comes to musical content, it really comes down to preference. Japanese video game music tends to be more melodic, while Western video game music tends to be more atmospheric. Regardless of personal preference, I believe that there are a ton of Western scores that can go toe-to-toe with the best that Japan has to offer. Thanks for watching. Alongside this video, I'm going to link to a playlist of all the music I've talked about or used for this video, in the order I used it. Check it out, there are a ton of great gems in there. I think it'd be worth it to give it a listen and think about some of the things I've said in this video while you compare and contrast the tracks. Or just sit back, close your eyes, and enjoy. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, subscribe to the channel, like and share the videos, or support me on Patreon. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.